We're in trouble now. So we're starting with a series of exciting pictures for this paper, which is actually where we started this as well. These pictures are all taken from a night that took place in London about a year ago now at Bar Whatever at the Royal Vauxhall Tavern, and it was a night we played in a band, and there were a lot of trans performers at the event, and we started thinking about what events trans performers are likely to play at, and perhaps if there were links between certain trans performers doing certain kinds of music. So we started thinking about bands we'd seen and promoters we knew, and we started thinking, is there a trans music scene, some sort of a series of events connected by certain people doing certain kind of things? And we started from a position of wanting to look at that and seeing what it was and what was going on.
So we did a little research project. I say little, it was very little. We did 4 interviews with participants, online, semi-structured. The first part of this presentation is going to use that interview data. Everything's been anonymised, we use pseudonyms. The second part of our presentation, we're using the other data that we gathered, so it was partly our own autoethnographic reflections on our own involvement, but also web resources from like the events and stuff.
So we have our 2 exciting diagrams, and we're going to talk about one central finding of this little piece of research, which was that the way in which promoters tended to regard the music they were doing and organise events, largely within this group of people we were looking at, largely reflected the way in which those particular individuals were defining their gender identity. And so we saw this happening in a kind of DIY, do-it-yourself way, kind of constructing, but also deconstructing. So on one hand, we've got people putting things together from the resources they have available to them, the discursive resources they have available to them. On the other hand, they're using a strategy of what we draw upon something called genre evasion, which we'll explain in a moment, where that also kind of takes things apart and starts kind of like cutting at those boundaries. So, I mean, starting off by looking at cut and paste, this idea, we actually shamelessly tabbed for in 2 locations. One is Kate Bornstein, who talks about, she was talking about transgender as something a bit more fluid than was typically understood at the time when she was writing, but she had this idea of transgender as, you know, a collage, a little bit of here, a little bit from there.
We saw this reflected in Hebditch's work on subcultures and ideas of bricolage, in which sort of new cultural formations took signifiers, bits of other people's cultures, and sort of used these all to sort of create a new form of culture. Some mods use like suits and things like that is kind of an example of that.
So, oh, it's gone backwards.
Yeah, and on the deconstruction side, we see genre evasion. It's kind of similar to this cut and paste thing, but the use of it's slightly different. So we took this from Steinholtz's work on punks in Russia, who used labels to try and get away from any kind of meaning that those labels can be used. So you see this in sort of musical forms where people go into sort of subgenres to the point where it becomes entirely meaningless, and they use so many different labels and they sort of cut and paste in a deconstructive rather than a constructive way.
So we're going to quickly define how we're using trans in this. We wanted to use trans as opposed to more rigid terms such as transsexual or transvestite, because we think trans is largely underdetermined, which I think is something that's come out today. But in a way that's kind of meaningful. So Stephen Whittle describes it as accessible to anyone who does not feel comfortable in the gender role they're attributed to at birth, or has a gender identity at odds with the labels man or woman. And the amazing thing about this is it's so loose that it could mean a lot. And trans, as opposed to transsexual or transgender or transvestite, has become such a loose term that people do use it in very different ways, and that's relevant to what we were doing. So, I mean, here are 3 very quick descriptions from our participants on what trans meant to them. And as you can see, they used slightly different ways. Alex talked about trans being the impetus to question things. Riley talked about trans as transcending gender. whereas Pat talked about trans in terms of oppositionality, being in opposition to social norms.
Here we see Robin using trans as a way of understanding their gender. So it's a useful shorthand, it's a window onto a more complex gender identity. It's also a useful umbrella which sort of highlights the multiplicity of trans, that it can mean many different things to one person as well as to many different people.
So there's a very big quote, but we're going to pick out some particular things. Pat takes a very interesting approach here in saying there's not any one thing we can agree on in terms of meaning talking about gender. Pat's kind of deconstructing gender as a category, sort of taking it apart. Can we even talk about such a thing as gender? But equally, at the same time, they're describing themselves, they're using, in a cut and paste manner, they're taking the idea of androgyny and applying it to themselves in a way that makes sense to them. And yet, even as they're doing that, they're deconstructing that idea at the same time. Does it really mean something? What does it mean? So, Pat's identity, as in some sense androgynous, exists in this tension between the constructive use of existing language and the deconstructive taking it apart.
Here we see Robin doing something similar. We see here the picking up lots of different words and smushing them together. There's the cut and paste in action, we see that. But it can only ever reach an approximation of what they're looking for, so it's the tension between the construction element of using these labels and the deconstruction element. And then here we see a very clear example of the sort of genre evasion type of using contradictory things to both get away from any meaning and also to draw further meanings on the ideas of what effeminate, queer man, butch woman can mean.
So a final example of this. This was particularly fascinating because Riley deconstructed his expectations during the interview. Because we asked, do you describe your gender identity as male? And he said, yes, wait, no. And then started asking, what it means to be male and how he feels. And ultimately, this element of cut and paste when we see, transgender, transmasculine, male, female again. It's kind of, again, we've got identity existing through tension between construction and deconstruction. And we can see, like, by the day-to-day aspect of it, it's all in a constant process of negotiation. Yeah, so this is talking about gender.
Distancing,
yeah.
So distancing from gender as an identity itself, and how some of our participants prefer to not have gender as part of their identity at all. Instead, they'd prefer to be labelled in this way, and we see here a lovely list of, again, different labels, different ways that they like to be understood.
No.
Oh,
well, never mind.
Okay, there we go. And then whereas Alex, who we've just seen, had that long list, for Pat, everything boils down to being a musician. There's no any other kind of identities there. This musician is all encompassing.
So you can see what we're doing here, this identity kind of coming about through sort of taking different labels, different understandings, things from culture and putting them together, but equally trying to avoid absolute definition. And this is what we see, ta-da, in the wider music community we looked at, which the people we just talked about were operating within.
So we, for the project, we made a little list of events that we saw as part of this, and this was the list of elements that we used to categorise them. So common themes were majority of trans performers, though mostly or almost exclusively not exclusively trans performers.
Yeah, so there would be bands with trans members, but not everyone in the band would be trans, or there would be trans solo performers.
But there would also occasionally be entirely cis acts. Also mixed genres, so usually it wouldn't be just, say, a punk night, it would be a night that has all different sorts of music, or not just music, it would have other sorts of
poetry
and all sorts. The events were nearly always open to the public, open to anyone who wanted to come in, whilst sort of remaining a safe space for questioning gender identities. there would normally be a different overarching theme, which we'll come back to in a minute and explain that.
But it would be something other than trans, which was very interesting.
And they'd all be sort of DIY organised outside.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, here's a list of events that we came up with as part of this.
We found more since then.
Yeah, this was so the project we did in the summer. This slide we wrote in the autumn, and since then there's been more added to this, or should be added to this. But so it started off based around London. We thought it was based around London or maybe the south of England. But then as we were working on it, we suddenly found out about this thing in Edinburgh and Glasgow. So we now see it's kind of, it's spreading. We don't know if anything in the north of England at the moment, but hopefully we can fill that gap.
But the fascinating thing about these was the musicians and performers sort of across them. So bands like the Mechanisms and the Makeshifts, performers like Dr. Carmilla, C.M. Lester, groups such as Lashings of Ginger Beer Time, or sort of lots of these artists, events, bands, lots of things crossing these different events. And that's kind of what's linking it. There is a shared set of performers and also in many cases a shared audience and similar promoters, some promoters operating in different areas.
Slight disclaimer, whilst we were doing the research project we decided to start running a night ourselves in Coventry called Revolt, which we weren't actually quite aware of what we were doing whilst we were doing it. We just wanted to put on a sort of feminist punk night. And then we realised that whilst we were doing the project we were sort of drawing in all these ideas that we basically got influenced by all the other stuff that we were looking at.
It was inadvertent feminist praxis.
Yeah, so we realised we should really put it on the list.
So what we're going to do is we're going to use an example of one thing to show how the deconstruction construction thing plays out. And we didn't intend for this because we originally did this particular presentation, this paper, at a different event. But it turns out both of the examples we're doing have people in the room. So this was actually, bizarrely, organised partly by Kat, which is where everything starts coming together in a very strange way. Yeah, so we're going to demonstrate lots of elements of deconstruction and construction where the event exists kind of in the tension between all of these.
Can I just say, we didn't intend any of this to happen.
Yeah, it was. So we didn't know we were ever going to be presenting at a seminar where Kat was going to be, for one thing. So yes, there are quite a few people involved in this at Nottingham, and the interesting thing was there was a collection of people who'd never been used to organising an event, and it was all a bit off the cuff, people putting it together, and in that sense it was a bit DIY, a bit like people constructing their identities. What can I find that suits me? And it felt like that on the day. You know, people chipped in. It was something that worked from people making it up as they went along, not using sort of power from above, in a sense. Yeah.
And again, we see the majority of trans performers, but and the majority of acts included trans members, but it wasn't entirely.
And this is a feature of every single night we looked at. Nights that were run by trans promoters, the majority of acts are trans. There would always be cis performers, both either as solo acts or as part of acts with trans people. And there wasn't this kind of clear, easy boundary. In a sense, there was a creation of a non-separatist state, you know. So it's not like sometimes the women's movement has women-only events and women-only performers, and that's also been seen, for example, in parts of the lesbian movement. And what we're seeing here is there's this move to stop it from being shut down. No one wants to do just a trans event for trans people. We can also see this in the open entry policies, which we mentioned earlier. It's open to everybody, anyone can come. It's not, so it's in a sense by and for trans people, but never just for trans people.
And in the case of Notts Pride, it was part of Nottingham Pride, so it was a £1 entry to the site, but beyond that, it was just in a tent in the field, so anyone could just walk in, walk out as they wanted.
And that, oh yes.
Do you want to say something else on the?
No, I'm fine with that.
Genre. So this is a small list of some of the sorts of genres that
quite literal genre evasion in this instance. Yeah. So we went on and played a very loud, shouty punk set immediately after a lovely piece of opera. And that was very much typical of the day. People are more interested. So, I mean, this is why it's in a sense about the trans artists being in one place, because it becomes about the trans artists rather than the musical style. But at the same time, it's not just about trans artists, and never is. And yeah, this point about a common theme, we see in Pride it was about pride, it was about visibility and community, it wasn't about here are all the trans people. We see that again in these posters from the Cutlery Drawer, which is run by Hal Gurney, who is also here, which is where it all starts coming together and getting very bizarre. And what's really interesting about these events, I'm going to wander here and upset the cameras because you're more important, is we have posters where every single act is either a trans person or acts with trans people in, and that's the unifying thing between these. And the word trans isn't mentioned anywhere on some of these. There is no mention there at all. I don't see a mention of trans anywhere, despite the fact we've got lashings of Ginger Beer Time, trans inclusive of trans members. The mechanism, similarly, trans inclusive, trans members. CN Leicester is trans, I'm trans, I was DJing at that event. But it was, if we talk about, you know, an overarching theme, the theme was feminism. It was a rape crisis fundraiser. There's no mention of the word trans anywhere on that poster because it's about trans and not about trans at the same time. We see a similar thing with this Moulin Rage, where the only mention of the word trans in this very trans lineup run by a trans promoter is a description of Sally Alton, presumably written by herself. And we even see this in a fundraiser for Gendered Intelligence, which is a trans charity, where again I don't see a single mention of the word trans on the flyer. There's a trans symbol, and that's considered enough, but what really matters is that there's a burlesque act, a comedian, a singer-songwriter, and an award-winning another comedian. And that's what's going on here. It's always about trans, but never about trans. It's about creating these boundaries, but taking them apart.
So we'd set out to find out if there was such a thing as a trans music community, and we decided that basically there wasn't. So a year and a half ago or so, I went to a workshop on punk, and Penny Rimbaud, who was in Crass, came up with the answer to what is punk, and he said it wasn't, because as soon as you start labelling what punk is, it loses any meaning. We decided
therefore trans isn't, in a sense. Trans exists in not existing, in that tension between construction and deconstruction. Trans music, therefore, isn't. And that was our conclusion. Thank you.